Okay, maybe today was your best day, or your worst. But if you're here, it means your mind just won't stop moving. Mine doesn't either. So for now, forget the noise, drown the outside world, kill the lights, and drift into this moment with me while the rest of mankind slumbers. Some stories don't live in daylight. They wait for nights like this, when the world is finally quiet enough to listen. This is history for the restless mind. Let's travel far away together. But before we descend into the story of stone and failure, I'm curious about where you are right now. If your eyes are still open, tell me. Are you an engineer wondering about the bridges you drive over? Are you someone fascinated by how ancient people built the impossible? Or are you simply someone who can't sleep, seeking meaning in the ruins of human ambition? Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Because I want to know if this story reaches the people who built bridges, or the people who simply walk across them, trusting that someone else got it right. And now, settle in, because the bridge we're about to discuss collapsed twice. Once in ancient Rome, and once more in the minds of engineers who thought they understood why. You need to understand something about Roman engineering before we can understand what it means to fail. The Romans were not like us. They did not calculate stress with computer algorithms or test materials in laboratories with precise instruments. They did not have the luxury of failure. Or rather, they had failure, plenty of it. But the cost was different. The cost was measured in human lives. In soldiers unable to cross a river during a campaign, in entire legions cut off from supply, in citizens trapped on the wrong side of a chasm when winter came. So the Romans developed something we might call structural intuition. They built and they watched what broke. They observed how stone behaves under weight. They learned across centuries which angles held and which angles collapsed. This knowledge was not written down in equations. It lived in the hands of master builders. It was passed from father to son, from master to apprentice, like a language spoken in stone. And it worked. For nearly 1,000 years it worked. The Roman bridges that still stand today, the Pont du Gard in France, the bridge at Alcantara in Spain, the Pons Fabricius here in Rome itself, these are not just surviving artifacts. They are testimony to a profound understanding of how to make stone resist the weight of the world. Modern engineers study them with a kind of reverence mixed with bewilderment. How did they know? How could they get it so right, so consistently, without the tools we have now? But here is the thing that modern engineers often miss when they study these surviving bridges. The Romans also failed, spectacularly, repeatedly, and in ways that should have taught them humility but instead often taught them arrogance. Because the successes were so numerous, so enduring, so magnificent, that the failures seemed like anomalies. Exceptions. Mistakes made by lesser builders, not true Romans. And so the knowledge of failure was not preserved the way the knowledge of success was. The collapses were forgotten. Or worse, they were remembered but reinterpreted, the lessons twisted to support the narrative of Roman invincibility. This is the paradox at the heart of our story. Roman engineering was advanced enough to build structures that would outlast empires. But it was not advanced enough to understand why those structures worked. The Romans built according to rules of thumb, according to aesthetic principles. according to what had worked before. They did not build according to physics, because physics had not yet been invented as a discipline. Newton would not be born for another 1700 years. This means that Roman bridges were, in a very real sense, built by accident, built by intuition that happened to align with mathematical truth, built by methods that worked, but for reasons the builders could not articulate. And this creates a dangerous situation, because when a method has worked 1,000 times, when every bridge you've ever built has stood, when your nation has conquered the world on the backs of structures you designed and built, it becomes very difficult to imagine that the next bridge might fail. It becomes very difficult to see the warning signs. It becomes very difficult to admit that you don't actually understand what you're doing. This is the story of the Pons Aemilius. But more than that, it's the story of what it means to build with confidence when you should be building with fear. It's the story of structures that collapse not because of incompetence, but because of a kind of arrogant brilliance. And it's the story of how that same arrogant brilliance has echoed through history, leading modern engineers to build the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, which swayed and danced in the wind like a living thing before it tore itself apart. And it has led them to build the Morandi Bridge in Genoa, which stood for 51 years before a section of it suddenly detached from its supports and fell, killing 43 people. The Pons Aemilius failed twice, once in ancient Rome, once more in our modern age, through the bridges that followed it, through the engineers who did not learn the right lessons from its collapse. To understand why, we have to go back to Rome itself, to the moment when the bridge was imagined, to understand the minds of the people who built it, to understand why they thought they could do something that, in the end, turned out to be beyond their capabilities. Imagine Rome, sometime in the 2nd century before Christ. The city is not yet the capital of the world, but it is becoming one. It is a place of ambition and violence and incredible engineering vision. The Tiber River runs through it, and the Tiber is not a gentle river. It is wild. It is unpredictable. It floods with the fury of a wounded animal when the rains come heavy in the mountains to the north, and in the dry seasons it becomes shallow and sluggish, a brown ribbon cutting the city in half. For centuries the Romans have managed with wooden bridges. They cross the river on structures made of timber, lashed together with rope, sturdy enough to last a few decades before rot and flood destroy them, and they must be rebuilt. This is an acceptable state of affairs. Wooden bridges are temporary. They are meant to be rebuilt. There is no shame in this. It is the natural order of things. But Rome is changing. The city is becoming more sophisticated. It is becoming richer. The trade that flows across the bridges is more valuable. The armies that need to cross them are larger. The citizens who depend on them are more numerous. And there is beginning to be a sense that Rome should have monuments, not just structures. That the city should announce itself not with wooden constructions that rot away, but with permanent testaments to Roman ingenuity and Roman power. And so, in the year 142 BCE, the Roman Senate decides to build a bridge in stone. That bridge will go on to be called the Pons Aemilius, named after the censor Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who oversaw its construction. It will be built at a specific location where the river is relatively narrow, but also where the currents are strong and the banks are prone to erosion. It will be the longest stone bridge ever built. It will have 6 arches, and it will cost an enormous amount of money, resources, and human labour. To understand what happens next, we need to understand what the Romans know about building bridges at this point in their history. They know that stone is stronger than wood. That much is obvious. They know that arches are stronger than straight beams, because they have seen arches in aqueducts and in buildings, and these structures stand. They know that the weight of a structure must be supported, and that the wider you make an arch, the more weight it will need to support. They know from intuition and from careful observation that certain proportions work better than others. But what they do not know, what they cannot know, because the mathematics do not exist yet to describe it, is the precise relationship between the width of an arch and the height of its supports. They do not know the concept of shear stress or tensile strength. They do not know how forces distribute through stone. They do not know the difference between a force that the material can bear and a force that it cannot. What they do know is this: we have built smaller stone bridges before, and they have worked. So if we build a larger stone bridge, using the same proportions, it should also work. This is not an unreasonable assumption. This is, in fact, the assumption that all engineers make before mathematics is invented to contradict it. But it is an assumption that contains within it a hidden danger. Because as structures get larger, as the proportions change, the assumption becomes less and less valid. A bridge twice as wide does not simply require twice as much stone. It requires exponentially more stone because the forces at play scale non-linearly. This is a principle that will not be fully understood until the Renaissance, when mathematicians and engineers finally begin to apply geometry and calculus to the problem of structure. But in ancient Rome, this principle is unknown, and so the Pons Aemilius is designed and built according to the principles that have worked before. Its arches are elegant, its proportions are beautiful. It is, by the standards of the time, a masterpiece. The bridge is completed, and for a while, for a long while actually, for about 3.5 centuries, it stands. It carries the weight of Rome across its stone arches. It becomes iconic. It is painted in the murals of Pompeii. It is celebrated by poets and orators. It is a symbol of Roman engineering prowess. But the river is patient. The Tiber is not done with the Pons Aemilius. In the year 1598, more than 16 centuries after its construction, something changes. The river rises. Perhaps there are heavy rains in the mountains. Perhaps there is an unusual flood season. The records are unclear, lost to history. But what is clear is that the pressure on the bridge becomes too great. One of the supports begins to fail. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but inexorably. The stone, subjected to forces it was never designed to bear, begins to compress beyond its limits. The mortar, and yes, Roman structures were held together not just by gravity and geometry, but by mortar, a primitive cement made from lime and volcanic ash, begins to fail. The stones shift slightly against each other. And then, in a moment that must have seemed like an earthquake to anyone nearby, one of the central arches collapses. The bridge does not fall completely. It breaks in half, but the two halves remain partially standing. The downstream portion collapses entirely into the river, but the upstream portion, the portion closer to the city, remains. It remains as a fragment, as a ruin. To this day, that fragment still stands. It is called the Ponte Rotto, the broken bridge. It is one of the most famous ruins in Rome. People visit it. They take photographs. They marvel at the fact that even a partially collapsed Roman bridge is more impressive than many intact structures built centuries later. But what the tourists do not often think about is what the collapse means. It means that the greatest engineering minds of the ancient world got it wrong. It means that the bridge was built according to principles that seemed sound but were actually unsound. It means that the confidence that the Romans had in their methods was misplaced. And most importantly, it means that the collapse happened because of a structural flaw, not because of poor maintenance or unusual circumstances. The bridge was not neglected into failure. It was designed into failure. The failure was built into it from the moment the first stone was laid. This is the crucial point that modern engineers have often missed. When the Pons Aemilius collapsed, most people assumed it was an anomaly. A bridge built slightly wrong. A miscalculation by the original engineers. Bad luck with the river. Most people did not assume what actually happened, that the collapse revealed a fundamental limitation in the methods that Roman engineers used to design bridges, that the methods had worked for smaller bridges but failed for larger ones, that the rules of thumb that worked for one scale of construction broke down at another scale. This distinction matters. It matters because it tells us something important about the relationship between knowledge and confidence. When a method has worked consistently for a long time, it is easy to assume that it will always work. It is hard to imagine the hidden limitation, the scale at which the method will fail. And so the engineers who came after the Pons Aemilius, the engineers who studied it and learned from it, often learned the wrong lessons. They learned that Roman bridges were magnificent but fragile, and that if you simply maintained them well, they would last. They did not learn that Roman bridges were magnificent but fundamentally limited in their scale. They did not learn that there was a maximum size beyond which the methods simply would not work. And this lesson remained unlearned for nearly 2,000 years. Here is something that is not often discussed in the history of engineering: the importance of failed structures. When a bridge collapses, it should teach us something. It should tell us that our assumptions were wrong. It should humble us. It should make us rethink our methods. But for this to happen, the collapse must be documented. It must be studied. It must be written about. The failure must be preserved in the historical record so that future generations can learn from it. The Pons Aemilius was studied, but not in the way we might hope. The bridge collapsed into the river. The surviving fragment remained, but the structure was not analysed by engineers trying to understand why it failed. Instead, it was studied by antiquarians trying to understand how it was built. The focus was on the method, not on the failure. The focus was on the marvel, not on the lesson. This is understandable in a way. Rome was collapsing during the 16th and 17th centuries. The Roman Empire was long dead. The city itself was in chaos, repeatedly conquered and reconquered, stripped of its resources, its population decimated by plague and war. In this context, what did it matter why an ancient bridge had failed? The bridge was a relic of a dead empire. Its failure was ancient history, not a pressing concern. But this forgetting, this failure to study the failure, had consequences. The knowledge that should have been extracted from the Pons Aemilius collapse was lost, and the methods that had led to its failure continued to be used in modified forms for centuries afterward. Engineers built larger and larger structures, confident in their methods, never imagining that there might be a limit, never understanding the mechanisms of failure, never recognizing the warning signs. This is the tragedy of lost knowledge. It is not always the loss of written documents or libraries burned or books destroyed. Sometimes it is the loss of understanding, the loss of the ability to interpret what we see, the loss of the wisdom to extract the right lessons from events. The Pons Aemilius taught humanity two different lessons depending on who was looking. For the people who lived near it, for the Romans who saw it collapse, it taught a simple and clear lesson. The bridge was built too ambitiously. The river was too strong. Large stone structures have limits. This was the obvious lesson. This was the lesson that experience and intuition immediately suggested. But for the engineers and mathematicians and intellectuals who came later, the lesson was different. They looked at the surviving fragment and they saw a marvel. They saw a structure that had lasted for 16 centuries before failing. They saw a work of engineering genius. And from this, they drew a different conclusion. The Romans knew how to build bridges. They built them so well that a bridge built in 142 BCE could still stand in 1598. The fact that it eventually collapsed was almost irrelevant. What mattered was how long it had stood. This reinterpretation of the collapse was a kind of forgetting. The failure became a success story. The collapse became a testament to the durability of the original design. And the lesson that should have been learned, that there are limits to what certain methods can achieve, was buried under layers of admiration and awe. This is where the story gets interesting for modern engineers, because the same forgetting has happened in modern times. Modern engineers have looked at ancient Roman structures, seen how long they have lasted, and drawn conclusions that are, in many ways, identical to the conclusions drawn by Renaissance scholars. They have seen the Pont du Gard standing for 2,000 years and thought, we should build like the Romans. We should use massive stone and simple geometry and trust in time-tested methods. And they have been partially right. Many Roman structures have endured. But the engineers have missed something crucial. They have missed the fact that the Roman structures that have survived are not necessarily the Roman structures that were best designed. They are the Roman structures that happen to be the right scale, or happen to be in locations where the forces were not too extreme, or happen to be maintained over the centuries. The structures that failed are gone, and in their absence, they cannot teach us anything. This is the fundamental problem with learning from history through observation alone. We tend to learn from the survivors, we study what has lasted, and we assume that the qualities that allowed certain structures to last are the qualities that made them good. But this is a bias. It is called survivorship bias, and it can lead us badly astray. The engineers who designed and built the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in 1940 were influenced, in part, by an understanding of how ancient engineers had built structures that had lasted. They knew about Roman engineering. They knew about the great stone bridges. And they drew from this knowledge the idea that if you build elegantly, if you build with aesthetically pleasing proportions, if you build according to principles that have worked in the past, then your structure will endure. But they did not know about the Pons Aemilius collapse. They had not studied the failures that had been forgotten. And so, they did not understand that elegance and proportion, while important, are not enough. There are forces at work in the world that do not care about elegance. There are modes of failure that cannot be anticipated by observing what has worked in the past. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was elegant. Its proportions were beautiful. And it collapsed because of forces that no one had predicted. It swayed in the wind with increasing amplitude, moving in ways that no engineer had anticipated, until finally the structure tore itself apart and fell into the water below. And in that moment, engineers had to confront a truth that the Romans had learned and then forgotten, that the rules of thumb do not scale infinitely, that there are limits to what we can build, that confidence in the methods can lead to catastrophic failure. Let's go back now, back to Rome, to 142 BCE, to the moment when the decision was made to build the Pons Aemilius. To understand not just the bridge itself, but the context of ambition in which it was created. Rome in the 2nd century before Christ is in a particular state. The city has conquered much of the known world, but it has not yet fully rationalized that power. It has not yet built the infrastructure that would allow it to administer an empire. The roads are being built, yes, the aqueducts are coming. The system of governance is being established. But Rome is still in transition from a city-state to an empire, and the energy and confidence of this transition is palpable everywhere. This is the moment when Rome begins to build monuments not just for practical purposes, but to declare itself to the world. The temples are getting larger, the public buildings are getting grander, and the infrastructure projects are becoming statements of power. The Pons Aemilius is one of these statements. The decision to build it is not made because there is no other way to cross the Tiber. There are other bridges already, but those bridges are made of wood. They are temporary. They are rebuilt every generation or so. They are utilitarian. And Rome is beginning to want something more than utilitarian. Rome is beginning to want something permanent, something that will announce to the world that Rome does not make temporary things. Rome makes things that last forever. The engineers who are chosen to build the Pons Aemilius are among the best in Rome. These are not men selected by lottery or by political favour. These are builders who have earned their reputation through years of successful projects. They are master builders. They understand stone. They understand arches. They understand how to move massive quantities of material and shape it into forms that hold together. And they are confident. This confidence is not arrogance, exactly. It is the confidence that comes from decades of success. It is the confidence that comes from knowing that every bridge you have ever built has stood. Every aqueduct has flowed. Every building has sheltered people through storms. The methods have worked, the principles have held. Why would they not work for the Pons Aemilius? And so the bridge is designed, and the design is bold. The bridge will have 6 arches. This is ambitious. More arches than most bridges of the time. Each arch will span nearly 23 metres. This is wide. very wide, wider than most stone arches that have been built before. The whole bridge will be long, it will be massive, it will dominate the landscape, it will be impossible to ignore. The construction begins. Picture it. Thousands of workers, slaves and free men, Romans and foreigners, all labouring under the Tiber sun. They are moving stone, enormous blocks of stone, each weighing many tons. They are cutting it, shaping it, fitting it into place. The sound is constant, the dust rises, the sweat runs. And slowly, over months and years, the bridge takes shape. The method of construction is similar to methods that have been used before, but adapted to the greater scale. First, the supports, the piers, portas, are built. These are the massive pillars that will hold up the arches. They are built in the riverbed itself, which means the builders have to contend with the water. They build temporary wooden dams to hold back the river. They dig down through the mud and silt until they reach bedrock. Then they build massive structures of stone on that bedrock. This is grueling work. The mud is deep, the water is cold and full of disease. Men die. Not from the construction itself necessarily, but from the conditions. From fever, from infections, from the simple hazards of working in water and mud day after day. But the work continues. Once the piers are built, the arches begin to go up. Each arch is constructed using a temporary wooden framework called centering. The wooden framework supports the stones of the arch while the arch is being built. The stones are laid one by one, carefully fitted together. And then, finally, the last stone, the keystone, is placed at the top of the arch. This stone wedges all the others into place. It is the final confirmation that the arch is holding itself up, that it is no longer dependent on the wooden framework. And then the wooden framework is removed. This is a moment of truth. This is the moment when the arch either stands on its own or it collapses. And with each arch of the Pons Aemilius, that moment comes. And each time, the arch stands. The engineers feel their confidence growing. Each successful arch is confirmation that they are doing it right. Each completed section of the bridge is proof that their methods work, even at this larger scale, even with these wider arches, even with these massive stones. By the time the final arch is complete, the bridge is standing. It is magnificent. It is exactly what the builders envisioned. It is longer than any stone bridge built before. Its arches are wider. Its stones are larger. It is, by any measure, the crowning achievement of Roman bridge building. The bridge is dedicated with great ceremony. There are sacrifices to the gods. There are celebrations. The engineering community of Rome celebrates this triumph. Here is proof of what Roman ingenuity can achieve. Here is proof that Rome is not just powerful in war, but powerful in creation. Rome can make things that last. Rome can build structures that will stand as long as Rome itself stands. The Pons Aemilius becomes iconic, and for 1,600 years it stands. Barbarians invade, empires rise and fall, the city of Rome is conquered and reconquered, civilizations are born and die. But the Pons Aemilius stands. It carries people across the Tiber. It becomes so much a part of the landscape that people barely notice it. It is just there. A bridge, a way to cross the river. And in those 1,600 years, the structure ages. The mortar weathers. The stones settle slightly. The wood that holds the structure together in places rots and is replaced. The river floods year after year, battering the supports. But the bridge stands. Until one day in 1598, it does not. In the year 1598, the Pons Aemilius is 1,740 years old. This is an astonishing age for a structure. There are civilizations that have not lasted this long. There are religions that have not endured for this span of time. There are empires that have risen and fallen and been forgotten entirely. And through all of this, the bridge stands. The people of Rome have become accustomed to its presence. It is part of the city. It is part of the landscape. No one remembers when it was built. No one remembers the builders. It has been there so long that it seems natural. It seems permanent. It seems like it will always be there. And then, in a single moment, it is not. The historical records of exactly what happened are fragmentary and unclear. What we know is this. There is a flood. The Tiber rises. This is not unusual. The Tiber floods regularly. Every few years, sometimes more often, the river rises above its banks and inundates the low-lying areas of the city. The bridges have been designed to withstand these floods. They have been tested by thousands of floods. They have never failed. But something is different about this particular flood. Perhaps it is exceptionally heavy. Perhaps the rains have been intense. Perhaps the snow in the mountains has melted rapidly, creating an unusual surge of water. The details are lost. But the effect is not. The effect is visible. The effect is catastrophic. The water pressure against the supports of the bridge increases. The support structures, which have been designed to bear the weight of the bridge and the water of normal floods, are subjected to forces beyond their design capacity. The stone, the same stone that has held together for 1,700 years, begins to give way. The failure does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. Over hours or days, the pressure builds. The stones shift, the mortar fails. Tiny cracks appear and become larger. The support structure begins to tilt. And then, finally, in a catastrophic moment, the central arch gives way. The bridge does not fall gracefully. It does not remain a neat structure that is merely damaged. Instead, it tears itself apart. The stonework that has been holding together through 17 centuries of history suddenly comes apart. Blocks of stone, massive stones that have been carefully fitted together, pull away from each other. The bridge collapses into the river. And then, something strange happens. The bridge does not fall completely. The downstream portion, the portion closer to the Tiber Island, collapses entirely. But the upstream portion, the portion closer to the city, remains partially standing. One arch survives. Part of the structure remains. It is a ruin, but it is a ruin that still stands. It is a fragment of what was once a complete bridge, and in that fragment, the bridge survives. For the next 4 centuries, the Ponte Rotto, the broken bridge, remains. It becomes a famous ruin. Artists paint it. Poets write about it. It becomes a symbol of the passage of time. It becomes a meditation on the impermanence of even our greatest works. It becomes, in its broken state, almost more famous than it was when it was whole. But what does the collapse mean? This is the question that should have been asked immediately. This is the question that should have been asked by every engineer in Europe. If the greatest engineers of ancient Rome could build a bridge that seemed perfect, that seemed permanent, that seemed to defy time itself, and that bridge could still collapse, then what does this tell us about the nature of structural failure? What does this tell us about the methods we use to design and build? The question is not asked. Or rather, it is asked, but not answered, because the collapse is interpreted as an anomaly. The bridge failed because it was 1,700 years old. It failed because the river was unusually violent. It failed because of bad luck or bad timing. It failed for reasons that have nothing to do with the original design. This is comforting, in a way. This interpretation allows the builders of the time to maintain their confidence in their methods. It allows them to think that the bridge failed because of circumstances beyond the control of any engineer, not because of a fundamental flaw in the design. But this interpretation is wrong. The bridge failed because of structural overconfidence. It failed because the design was at the limit of what was possible given the methods available. It failed because 17 centuries of tiny degradations, weathering, settlement, water damage, had slowly reduced the safety margin of the structure until it was almost zero. And then, when the bridge was subjected to unusual conditions, when it was pushed just a little bit harder than it had ever been pushed before, it could not take it. The bridge had not been built with any safety margin at all. It had been built right at the edge of what was possible. And when conditions changed, when reality proved to be slightly more demanding than the average circumstances the bridge had been designed for, the bridge failed. This is a crucial insight for modern engineers, because the same pattern repeats itself throughout history. Structures are built with confidence. They are designed according to methods that have worked before. They are built according to aesthetic and practical principles. They succeed for years or decades or centuries. And then, when they are subjected to unusual conditions, when they are pushed beyond their average operating parameters, they fail. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was built in 1940. It was considered a marvel of modern engineering. It was elegant. Its cables were beautiful. Its towers were tall and slender. It was designed by some of the best engineers of the time. And it failed because of forces that no one had predicted. The wind did not have to be particularly strong. It just had to blow in a particular way, at a particular frequency, at a particular resonance with the structure itself. And when it did, the bridge began to oscillate. And the oscillations grew. And finally the bridge tore itself apart. This should not have been a complete surprise. There were engineers who understood, from first principles, that suspension bridges had natural frequencies that could be excited by wind. But these engineers were not listened to. The design went forward. The bridge was built. And when it failed, it shocked everyone. But should it have? If you had told an engineer in 1940 that a bridge could collapse because it was swaying too much in the wind, they might have laughed. Swaying? Why would swaying cause a collapse? The bridge is made of steel. Steel is strong. Swaying is not going to break steel. And they would be right, in a way. Steel is strong. Swaying alone would not break it. But swaying at the right frequency, with the right amplitude, for the right duration, could cause the materials to fail, could cause metal fatigue, could cause the bridge to tear itself apart from the inside out. This is the same pattern as the Pons Aemilius. The bridge is designed according to methods that have worked before. The bridge is built. And then it fails because of forces that the designers did not fully understand. Who were the engineers of ancient Rome? This is a question that is rarely asked directly, but it is worth thinking about. Because understanding who built the bridges tells us something about how they were built. It tells us about the mindset that produced such magnificent structures. It tells us about the confidence and the blindness that went hand in hand. The engineers of Rome did not have degrees from universities. They did not have professional certifications. They did not belong to guilds that maintained standards or provided insurance. There was no licensing board to ensure that they knew what they were doing. There was no liability. If a bridge collapsed and killed people, the engineer might be blamed. He might lose his reputation. But there was no legal recourse. There was no lawsuit. There was no accountability system. But there was accountability of another kind. The reputation was everything. If you were a master builder and you built a structure that collapsed, you were ruined. Your next job might not come. You might not be trusted with important projects. You might be relegated to smaller, less prestigious work. Or you might be blamed for the collapse and executed. Roman justice was not always gentle. This created a system in which only the most talented, most careful, most intelligent engineers survived and prospered. The bad engineer, the ones who got it wrong, were eliminated from the profession through the simple expedient of having their failures become so obvious that they were never hired again. The surviving engineers, the ones whose names we know, the ones whose works have lasted, were therefore exceptionally talented. They had to be. The system selected for talent and intelligence, but they were also limited. The limitation was not in their ability. The limitation was in their knowledge. They did not have calculus. They did not have physics. They did not have the tools to calculate the precise stresses in a structure. They did not have the mathematics to predict how a structure would behave under various conditions. What they had instead was intuition. They had observation. They had the accumulated wisdom of centuries of builders. They knew from experience that certain proportions worked better than others. They knew that certain methods of construction were more reliable. They knew without being able to articulate it many of the principles of structural mechanics. But knowing something intuitively is not the same as understanding it, and the difference between intuition and understanding can be dangerous. An intuitive understanding works fine as long as you are working within the range of experience that created the intuition. If you have built 100 bridges, each one following the same basic proportions and methods, then your intuition about what works is probably accurate. You have built 100 bridges, and they have all stood. So the next bridge, built with the same methods, will probably also stand. But if you try to go outside that range of experience, if you try to build something significantly different, then the intuition can fail. You can go wrong. And you might not know you are going wrong until the bridge collapses. This is what happened with the Pons Aemilius. The engineers who built it were exceptional. They were probably the best engineers in Rome. They understood arches. They understood how to build in stone. They had built many bridges before. And their intuition, based on decades of experience, told them that the proportions and methods they were using would work. But they were pushing beyond the range of their experience. The arches were wider than anything they had built before. The bridge was longer. The scale was larger. And in pushing beyond the range of their experience, They passed beyond the range of their experience. They passed beyond the range of their intuition. They were building according to principles that worked at smaller scales, but they did not know that the principles would fail at this larger scale. This is the danger of confidence built on success. The engineers of Rome had succeeded so many times that they began to believe their methods were infallible. They began to believe that if something had worked at one scale, it would work at any scale. This is a very human belief. We all tend to extrapolate from our experience. If something has worked 10 times, we assume it will work the 11th time. If it has worked 100 times, we assume it will work forever. But this is not how reality works. Reality does not care about our track record. Reality does not reward consistency. Reality simply follows the laws of physics, and those laws change as the scale of things changes. A principle that works for a 10-metre arch does not necessarily work for a 23-metre arch. The mathematics are different. The stresses are different. The behaviour of the material under those stresses is different. But the engineers did not know this. They could not know this. The mathematics that would allow them to calculate these differences would not be invented for another 1,000 years. So they built according to intuition. And their intuition, formed by centuries of successful smaller structures, told them that the methods would work. And they were confident. And they built a bridge that was magnificent and elegant and perfect. And that would ultimately fail. This is not a condemnation of the engineers. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge available to them. They were not stupid. They were not careless. They were not arrogant in a petty way. They were confident in their methods because the methods had worked. This is a rational response to experience. But it is also a dangerous response, because confidence based on experience can be misplaced, because the methods that work for small bridges might not work for large bridges, because the scaling of physics is not linear. And this lesson, learned so brutally by the collapse of the Pons Aemilius, was apparently forgotten. Or rather, it was learned by the people who lived through the collapse. The Romans of 1598 who saw the bridge come down would have understood in their bones that there are limits to what you can build. They would have understood that confidence can be misplaced. They would have understood that you cannot simply scale up what works at smaller scales. But that knowledge did not survive in the written record. The collapse was recorded. The ruin was preserved. But the interpretation of the collapse, the reasons for it, the lessons from it, was lost. Or rather, it was reinterpreted. It was turned into a story about the durability of Roman engineering rather than a story about its limitations. And so the same mistakes would be made again, centuries later, by modern engineers who had not learned the lessons that should have been learned from the Pons Aemilius. Skip forward 4 centuries. It is now 1940. The Great Depression is ending. The Second World War is beginning in Europe, but America is still neutral. The country is in a building mood. Bridges are being constructed across canyons and rivers. Dams are being built. The infrastructure of the modern world is being created. And engineers are confident. They have steel. They have concrete. They have mathematics and physics. They have computers that can calculate stress distributions. They have a level of knowledge and tools that the Romans could never have imagined. Surely with all this, bridge collapses should be a thing of the past. In the Puget Sound region of Washington state, there is a waterway called the Tacoma Narrows. It is a deep, treacherous channel of water. On one side is the city of Tacoma. On the other side is the Kitsap Peninsula, and crossing between them requires a bridge. For a long time, the only way to cross was by ferry. But in the 1930s, there is a push to build a bridge, to connect the two sides, to allow cars to cross. A bridge is designed. It is a suspension bridge. This is a modern design. The weight of the roadway is suspended from massive cables that stretch across tall towers. The cables are anchored on either side, and the roadway hangs from the cables. Suspension bridges are elegant. They are also efficient. They can span long distances. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge will be 2,737 feet long. This is nearly half a mile. It is a substantial bridge. The engineer in charge is Leon Moisseiff. He is a renowned bridge engineer. He has designed many successful bridges. He is confident in his methods. The bridge design is approved. It is considered a marvel of modern engineering. The bridge will be elegant and efficient. Construction begins in 1938. The bridge is completed in July 1940. The opening is celebrated. Thousands of people cross the bridge on opening day. The newspapers run photographs of the sleek, elegant structure. It is a triumph of American engineering. It is a testament to what modern methods can achieve. And then, 4 months later, the bridge starts to move. The motion is small at first, nearly imperceptible, but it is there. When the wind blows, the bridge sways. This is not unexpected. All bridges sway a little in the wind, but the amount of sway is unusual. The bridge is moving more than it should be, more than the designer predicted. Engineers are called. They study the bridge. They conclude that there is no danger. The bridge is designed to sway. The sway is within acceptable parameters. There is no structural problem. The bridge is safe, but the motion continues, and it begins to escalate. On November 7th, 1940, the weather is windy but not unusually so. The wind speed is around 35 miles per hour. Not a gale, not a hurricane. A moderate wind. But at around 10 a.m., something begins to happen to the bridge. The roadway begins to move up and down. The motion is rhythmic. The motion is increasing in amplitude. The bridge is bouncing. Up and down. Up and down. Like a living thing. Like something that is breathing. People on the bridge begin to feel ill. They feel dizzy. They feel like they are seasick. Some of them leave their cars and walk to safer ground. A cameraman named Barney Elliott sets up his camera to film the motion. And then the motion changes. The bridge is not just moving up and down anymore, it is also twisting. The roadway is rotating. One side going up while the other side goes down. Twisting along the length of the bridge, the motion is becoming more violent. The amplitude is increasing. The bridge is swaying several feet up and down. The roadway is rotating visibly. And people realize that something is wrong. Cars are abandoned. People run off the bridge. There is a dog trapped in one of the cars. A man named Leonard Coatsworth drives back onto the bridge to try to rescue it. As he drives, the bridge beneath him is moving violently. The concrete roadway is cracking. He can see cracks appearing. He drives toward one end, but the bridge is moving so much that the roadway tilts at impossible angles. He cannot control his car. He crashes. He gets out and crawls off the bridge to safety. And then, at 10:52 a.m., the bridge tears itself apart. The roadway breaks. The steel structures that make up the bridge fail. The entire section in the middle of the span falls. It falls into the water below. It falls 190 feet, and as it falls, it takes with it the section of roadway and the cable supports. The bridge does not collapse gracefully. It does not fall neatly. It explodes. It tears itself apart. Metal screeches, components shatter, and then silence. The bridge is gone. Miraculously, no humans are killed. The dog was not rescued, and it is the only death. But the bridge is completely destroyed. One of the most modern bridges in America, built with all the latest engineering knowledge and techniques, has collapsed. And the shock is profound. How could this happen? How could a modern bridge, designed by renowned engineers, using modern materials and modern methods, collapse so completely? It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be engineered to exacting standards. It was supposed to be a triumph of modern engineering. And yet it failed. In the aftermath, engineers studied the debris. They tried to understand what had happened, and they discovered something shocking. The bridge had failed because of a phenomenon that engineers knew about theoretically, but had underestimated in practice. The wind had been blowing at a certain speed and direction. This wind had set the bridge into oscillation. The oscillation had a particular frequency, a natural frequency that matched the frequency at which the bridge wanted to move. And as the wind continued to blow, it kept pushing the bridge at that frequency, and the amplitude of the oscillation grew and grew until finally the structure could not withstand the forces. And it failed. This phenomenon is called resonance. It is the same principle that allows an opera singer to shatter a glass with their voice. If you sing the right note, the right frequency, the glass vibrates at its natural frequency, and the amplitude of the vibration grows until the glass cannot withstand the force and it breaks. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge had a natural frequency. The wind had found that frequency, and the bridge had oscillated itself to destruction. But here is the crucial point. Engineers had known about resonance before the bridge was built. It was not a mysterious, unknown phenomenon. It was taught in physics textbooks. It was understood by physicists and mathematicians. But the engineers who designed the bridge had not fully appreciated the danger. They had not believed that wind could excite the bridge at its natural frequency with enough amplitude to cause failure. They had assumed that the bridge was strong enough to withstand any wind. They had assumed that the elegant proportions they had chosen were safe. And they were wrong. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed because the designers had confidence in their methods that was not fully justified. They had built a bridge according to aesthetic principles and according to methods that had worked for other bridges, but they had not fully considered the dynamic behavior of the structure. They had not fully understood the mechanisms by which wind could interact with the bridge to cause failure. And when the bridge failed, it taught a lesson that should have been clear centuries before, that confidence in your methods can lead to catastrophic failure, that scaling up a design does not guarantee that the scaled-up design will behave the same way as the original, that there are modes of failure that you cannot anticipate if you are only thinking about static loads, that elegance and efficiency are not the same as safety. There is a story that illustrates the difference between the way engineers think and the way physicists think. After the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed, there was an investigation. Engineers and physicists worked together to understand what had happened, and there was a moment in that investigation where a physicist asked a question that revealed something interesting about the assumptions that engineers make. The physicist asked, "Why did you not design the bridge to be stiff enough to resist the wind?" The engineer replied, "Because if we made the bridge stiff enough to resist the wind, it would not be able to flex when cars crossed it. The flexing is necessary. The flexing absorbs the impact of the traffic. If the bridge were completely stiff, the impact of each car would create sudden forces that would be worse for the structure than the flexing." And the physicist understood. There was a trade-off. If you made the bridge too stiff, you created one set of problems. If you made it too flexible, you created another set of problems. The engineer had tried to find a balance, but the balance they had found was not far enough from the danger zone. This illustrates something important about the way engineers work. Engineers do not think in absolutes. They think in trade-offs. They think in terms of what works well enough. They think in terms of meeting specifications and codes and standards. They think in terms of cost and efficiency and aesthetics. All of these factors go into the design of a bridge, but they do not always think in terms of extreme conditions. They do not always ask, what if the wind is stronger than I expect? What if the cars are heavier than I expect? What if the bridge is subjected to a condition I have not anticipated? Physicists, on the other hand, often think more in terms of first principles and extreme conditions. A physicist asked to design a bridge might not come up with an elegant, efficient design. They might come up with something over-engineered, something that uses more material than necessary, something that is wasteful. But it would be safe under a wide range of conditions. Engineers think about what is likely, physicists think about what is possible. And this difference in thinking has profound implications for safety. The Romans thought like engineers. They designed for the conditions they expected. They built according to methods that had worked in the past. They did not design for the worst possible case. They designed for the most likely case. And for 1,700 years, this worked. The Pons Aemilius stood through normal conditions. It stood through normal floods. It stood through normal wear and tear. And then, when conditions were slightly worse than normal, when the flood was a bit heavier than usual, the bridge failed. The engineers who designed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge thought like engineers. They designed for the conditions they expected. They designed according to standards and specifications that had been established based on past experience. They did not think deeply about dynamic effects. They did not think deeply about resonance. They did not think about the possibility that the wind could excite the bridge in a way that had not been anticipated, and when conditions were slightly different than expected. When the wind blew at just the right frequency and speed, the bridge failed. This pattern is not unique to these two bridges. It repeats itself throughout history. It happens whenever engineers design, according to past experience, without fully understanding the underlying physics. It happens whenever there is a gap between the methods that have worked and the understanding of why the methods work. The gap is dangerous. The gap is where failures live. After the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, engineers studied the phenomenon of wind-induced oscillation much more carefully. They developed better methods for predicting how a bridge would respond to wind. They added damping systems, devices that absorb oscillations to reduce the amplitude of motion. They change the design of bridges to avoid natural frequencies in the range of wind speeds that are common. And the result is that modern suspension bridges are much safer than the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was. But the danger is not completely eliminated, because the same pattern continues. Designers make assumptions about the conditions that their structures will face, and sometimes those assumptions are wrong. Sometimes conditions arise that were not anticipated, and sometimes when those unanticipated conditions occur, structures fail. Let's talk about the mathematics of failure. Let's talk about why the Pons Aemilius had to fail, why it was mathematically inevitable. To do this, we need to understand something about how forces behave in arches. When you build an arch out of stone, the weight of the arch is transmitted downward through the arch to the supports at either end, but the weight is not transmitted straight down. Instead, it is transmitted along the curve of the arch, and this means that the forces are not purely vertical. There is also a horizontal component. The arch is trying to push outward at its base. This is why arches need supports called abutments. The abutments hold back the horizontal force. They keep the arch from spreading. Now, if you have a small arch, this is not a problem. The horizontal force is small. The abutments do not need to be very large or very strong to hold it back. But if you have a larger arch, if you increase the span of the arch, the forces increase, and they increase in a non-linear way. Specifically, the forces increase roughly with the square of the span. If you double the span, you increase the forces by a factor of 4. If you triple the span, you increase the forces by a factor of 9. This is a fundamental law of physics. It is not something that can be avoided. It is not something that scales linearly. It is not something that the Romans could have changed, even if they had understood it. The Romans designed the Pons Aemilius with arches that spanned about 23 meters. This was significantly larger than the arches they had built before. The largest previous arches were probably around 15 meters in span, so the span was increased by a factor of about 1.5, but the forces increased by a factor of about 2.25. This is the non-linear scaling. And the Romans did not know about this. They could not have known about it. They did not have the mathematics to calculate it. So they designed the supports according to the proportions they had used before. They used roughly the same ratio of arch size to support size that had worked for smaller arches. They applied the same principles. They used the same building methods. And the result was that they built a bridge that looked strong enough, but was actually at the very edge of what was structurally possible. They built a bridge that worked, but only barely. They built a bridge that had almost no safety margin. And this is why it eventually failed. The bridge did not fail because of poor construction. The construction was excellent. The stones are still visible today, and they are expertly fitted. The mortar was well made and properly applied. The workmanship is superb. The bridge failed because of physics. It failed because the forces involved in holding up a 23-meter arch are significantly greater than the forces involved in holding up a 15-meter arch. And the structure was not designed to handle these greater forces. It was designed according to intuition and experience that had informed in the context of smaller arches. Now, could the Romans have designed a stronger bridge? Of course. if they had made the supports larger, if they had used thicker stones, if they had used better materials, if they had built with more margin for error, the bridge might have lasted longer. It might never have failed. But to do this, they would have needed to know that the forces were greater than they thought. They would have needed to know about the non-linear scaling of forces with span. And they did not know this. They could not have known this. This is the tragedy of engineering without physics. You can be very good at what you do. You can have excellent intuition. You can build things that last. But you can also build things that fail because you do not understand the underlying principles. You can be confident in your methods and still be wrong. And this is the lesson that has been repeated throughout history. When mathematics and physics were finally developed to the point where engineers could calculate stresses and predict failures, one of the first things they discovered was that many of the structures that had been built using rule-of-thumb methods were operating very close to their limits. The Gothic cathedrals of medieval Europe were marvels of construction. But when they were analysed mathematically, it turned out that many of them were just barely standing. They were built so that the forces were perfectly balanced, almost like a magic trick. Any change to the weight distribution, any settling of the foundation, any weathering that weakened the stone, and the whole structure could fail. Some of them did fail. Some of these magnificent cathedrals have experienced collapses. Some have had to be extensively reinforced after they were found to be at risk. But many of them have not failed. Many of them are still standing. And this is partly luck, but it is also partly because they were built in a way that, while not always well understood, was often very efficient. The medieval builders had learned through centuries of trial and error how to build with minimal material while still maintaining safety. They were not wasting resources, they were building at the edge of what was possible. And so, paradoxically, some of the finest examples of medieval architecture are the most fragile. They are standing only because of good luck and constant maintenance. They are monuments to human ambition and skill, but also to human hubris. The belief that you can push the limits further and further without consequences. I'll skip forward again. It is now 2018, more than 70 years after the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsed. We have learned so much. We have built so many bridges. We have developed sophisticated methods for calculating stresses. We have used computer models to simulate structures. We have physics. We have mathematics. We have knowledge that the Romans could never have imagined. And yet, on August 14th, 2018, a bridge in Genoa, Italy, collapses. The Morandi Bridge, also known as the Polsevera Viaduct, was built in 1967. It was considered a marvel of modern engineering. It was designed by Riccardo Morandi, a renowned Italian engineer. It was a cable-stayed bridge, a more modern design than the old suspension bridges. The main towers supported the roadway with cables, similar to a suspension bridge, but the design was different. The cables were anchored to pylons, rather than extending all the way to the ground. The bridge stood for 51 years, without significant problems. It carried hundreds of thousands of vehicles across it every day. It was part of the infrastructure of Genoa. It was so much a part of the landscape that people barely noticed it. And then, on a rainy day, one of the support structures, suddenly separated from its mountings. A section of the bridge about 200 meters long broke away. It fell, and as it fell, it crushed everything below it. Cars, trucks, buildings, people. 43 people died. Some of them were in vehicles on the bridge when it fell. Some of them were in buildings below. Some of them were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was one of the worst structural failures in modern times. It was shocking. It was tragic. It was supposed to be impossible. How could a modern bridge built with modern materials and modern knowledge collapse? In the aftermath, engineers studied the bridge. They examined the cables. They examined the steel. They examined the design. And they discovered something that was both obvious and shocking. The bridge had not been maintained properly. The cables had corroded, the steel had rusted, there was water damage, there was deterioration. In other words, the bridge had failed because of neglect. But is this the full story? The engineers who investigated the collapse also discovered something else. The design of the bridge had never been as strong as it should have been. The cables had been sized based on calculations and assumptions that had proven to be optimistic. The safety margin built into the design was smaller than it should have been. The bridge had been designed to meet the standards of the time, but those standards had not accounted for all the ways that a bridge could be damaged over time. In other words, the bridge had been designed to be just barely safe, assuming perfect conditions. And when conditions were not perfect, when the bridge deteriorated due to lack of maintenance, the bridge failed. This is the same pattern as the Pons Aemilius. This is the same pattern as the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. The structure is designed according to the assumptions and methods of its time. The structure works as long as conditions match those assumptions. But when conditions are slightly different, when there is more corrosion than expected, or more wind or more traffic, the structure fails. And people are shocked because they believe the structure was safe. They believe that modern engineering had solved the problem of failure. They believed that we knew how to build things that would not collapse, but we still do not know. Or rather, we know the theory, we know the mathematics, we know the physics, but we still make the same mistakes. We still design at the edge. We still build with minimal safety margins. We still assume that normal maintenance will be performed and that conditions will not deviate significantly from what we expect. And sometimes we are wrong. The collapse of the Morandi Bridge in Genoa killed 43 people. It was the direct result of poor maintenance, yes, but it was also the result of a design that had been too confident about its own safety. A design that had not been built with adequate margins for error. And this is the ghost of the Pons Aemilius, haunting us still. There is a psychological element to bridge failures that is often overlooked. When a bridge is built, and it stands for a long time without failing, confidence grows. This confidence is not irrational. The bridge has proven itself. It has carried traffic. It has survived storms. It has shown that it is well built. There is reason for confidence. But the confidence can become excessive. The longer a bridge stands, the more confident we become that it will always stand. We become so accustomed to its presence that we forget that it is a human creation, subject to human limitations. We forget that it was designed according to specific assumptions about what it would encounter. We forget that those assumptions might be wrong. This is what happened with the Morandi Bridge. It had stood for 51 years without significant problems. People had become confident that it would always stand. The authorities responsible for maintaining it had become complacent. There was no sense of urgency about maintenance. Why would there be? The bridge had never failed. The bridge was fine. And then it failed. The Romans experienced the same thing. The Pons Aemilius had stood for 1,700 years. For 17 centuries, people had crossed it. For 17 centuries, it had not failed. The confidence in the bridge must have been absolute. The idea that it could collapse must have seemed absurd. And then it collapsed. This pattern of confidence leading to neglect, and neglect leading to failure, has repeated many times in the history of engineering. It happened with the Pons Aemilius. It happened with the Morandi Bridge. And it will happen again. Because confidence is not an accident. It is not a personal failing on the part of engineers or authorities. It is a natural response to experience. If something has worked well for a long time, it is natural to assume that it will continue to work well. But this assumption can be dangerous. There is a concept in safety engineering called the accident precursor. An accident precursor is a small failure or anomaly that indicates that larger failure is possible. If you pay attention to accident precursors, if you treat them seriously, you can often prevent the larger failure from happening. But if you ignore the accident precursors, if you dismiss them as minor issues, if you have become too confident to think that a real failure is possible, then the larger failure will often occur. With the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, there were accident precursors. The bridge was swaying more than expected. Engineers should have taken this seriously. They should have studied the motion carefully. They should have been willing to entertain the possibility that the bridge was not as stable as they had believed. But instead, they dismissed the swaying as a minor issue. They believed that the bridge was fundamentally sound. And then the bridge failed. With the Morandi Bridge, there were certainly accident precursors. There was corrosion, there was water damage, there was deterioration. These were all signs that the bridge's condition was degrading. These were all indications that maintenance was needed. But the authorities responsible for the bridge did not treat these signs seriously enough. They did not act with sufficient urgency. And the bridge failed. The lesson here is not that engineers are incompetent or careless. The lesson is that human nature has a tendency to discount dangers that seem unlikely. If something has never happened before, we assume it will never happen. If a structure has stood for a long time, we assume it will stand forever. But this is not how reality works. Reality does not reward complacency. Reality does not care about our expectations. And so bridges that have stood for centuries collapse. Bridges that have been carefully engineered fail. Bridges that have never shown a significant problem suddenly show a catastrophic problem. This is the ghost of the Pons Aemilius. It is the reminder that confidence, no matter how well justified by past experience, can be misplaced. It is the warning that we must remain vigilant. We must pay attention to small problems. We must not become so confident in our methods that we forget to question them. If the Pons Aemilius collapse had been properly understood and documented, what lessons should have been learned? The first lesson should have been this. As structures get larger, The methods that work for smaller structures may not work. The proportions that are stable at one scale may not be stable at another scale. The forces involved in a large structure are not simply scaled versions of the forces in a small structure. This lesson was eventually learned, but it took nearly 2,000 years for it to be properly understood and articulated. It required the development of mathematics and physics. It required engineers to move beyond intuition and to calculate forces from first principles. It required a fundamental shift in how structures were designed. But this lesson should have been visible in the collapse of the Pons Aemilius itself. The bridge was larger than previous bridges. The bridge failed. The conclusion should have been obvious. Perhaps the larger scale had something to do with the failure. The second lesson should have been this: confidence in your methods is not the same as understanding why your methods work. The Romans had built many successful bridges. They had strong reasons to be confident in their methods. But confidence in the methods did not mean they understood the underlying physics. And misunderstanding the underlying physics meant that the methods could fail when applied to new situations. This is a lesson that applies to all of engineering, not just bridge building. When you have a method that works, it is easy to assume that you understand why it works. But you might not. You might understand only the surface level of why it works. You might be missing crucial factors, and these missing factors might matter in new contexts. The third lesson should have been this: when a structure fails, you must investigate not just the immediate causes, poor construction, bad materials, unusual conditions, but also the design itself. You must ask whether the design was fundamentally sound, or whether the failure reveals a flaw in the assumptions behind the design. With the Pons Aemilius, the immediate cause of the failure was probably the flood. The river rose higher than usual. The pressure on the supports exceeded what they were designed to handle. This is understandable, but the real failure was in the design. The design did not account for the possibility of larger floods. Or rather, the design assumed that the proportions that had worked for smaller bridges would continue to work for larger bridges. And this assumption was wrong. These three lessons, if they had been properly learned and remembered, might have prevented the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse. The engineers who designed that bridge might have been more cautious about scaling up the design. They might have been more careful to understand the underlying physics, not just to follow the methods that had worked before. They might have been more willing to question their assumptions, but the lessons were not preserved. The knowledge was lost, or rather, the knowledge was embodied in the wreck of the Pons Aemilius, but the lessons were not extracted from it. And so history repeated itself. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge was designed according to methods that had worked before. It was designed according to aesthetic and practical principles. It was designed to be elegant and efficient. But it was designed without full understanding of how wind could interact with the bridge to produce oscillations at the bridge's natural frequency. And when the wind did produce those oscillations, the bridge failed. 51 years later, in Genoa, the Morandi Bridge failed. This bridge had been built with more advanced knowledge than either the Pons Aemilius or the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. The designers understood more about how forces behave in structures. They had calculated the stresses more carefully. They had used computer models. but they had still designed a bridge with minimal safety margins. They had still assumed that conditions would remain normal. They had still believed that their understanding was complete, when in fact, there were always gaps in that understanding. And when the conditions changed, when maintenance was neglected and corrosion weakened the structure, the bridge failed. Every structure is designed based on assumptions. The designer assumes that the materials will behave a certain way. The designer assumes that the conditions will be within a certain range. The designer assumes that the maintenance will be performed. The designer assumes that the structure will not be subjected to forces beyond what it was designed for. These assumptions are not always stated explicitly. Often they are so deeply embedded in the design process that the designer does not even realize they are making assumptions. They are just doing what has always been done. They are following the standards and codes and practices that are established in their profession. But the assumptions are there, hidden beneath the surface. With the Pons Aemilius, one of the hidden assumptions was that the proportions that worked for smaller bridges would work for larger bridges. This assumption was never explicitly stated. It was just embedded in the design process. The designers looked at successful smaller bridges. They scaled them up. They kept the same proportions. It seemed reasonable. But the assumption was wrong. With the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, one of the hidden assumptions was that the wind would not excite the bridge at its natural frequency with enough amplitude to cause failure. This assumption was never explicitly stated. The designers knew about resonance in theory, but they did not fully appreciate the danger. They assumed that the bridge was strong enough to withstand any wind. The assumption seemed reasonable, but it was wrong. With the Morandi Bridge, one of the hidden assumptions was that the structure would be properly maintained. This assumption was never explicitly stated. The designers knew that maintenance would be necessary, but they did not design the bridge with enough safety margin to account for the possibility that maintenance might be neglected or deferred. The assumption seemed reasonable, but it was wrong. These hidden assumptions are dangerous because they are not examined. They are not questioned. They are just accepted as part of the normal way of doing things. To protect against hidden assumptions, engineers need to make their assumptions explicit. They need to ask themselves, what am I assuming about how this structure will behave? What am I assuming about the conditions it will encounter? What am I assuming about how it will be maintained? And then, for each assumption, they need to ask, what if I am wrong? This is the discipline of design under uncertainty. It is the recognition that our knowledge is incomplete. It is the humility to admit that we do not understand everything about how our structures will behave. But humility is not a dominant feature of engineering culture. The dominant feature is confidence. Engineers are trained to be confident. They are trained to believe that they understand their field. They are trained to make decisions and stand by them. This confidence is necessary. Without it, nothing would ever be built. Every project would be paralyzed by doubt. But the confidence can be taken too far. It can become arrogance. And arrogance is the enemy of safety. The Romans had arrogance. They had built so many successful structures that they believed they understood the limits of what was possible. They did not. The Pons Aemilius proved that. The engineers who designed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge had arrogance. They believed that they understood how suspension bridges behaved. They believed that the methods that had worked for smaller bridges would work for larger ones. They did not. The collapse proved that. The engineers who designed the Morandi Bridge had arrogance. They believed that the structure they had designed would be maintained properly. They believed that the safety margins they had built in were adequate. They did not. The collapse proved that, and the engineers who are designing and building structures today also have arrogance. They believe that they understand how structures will behave. They believe that their methods are sound. They believe that the structures they are building will be safe. And they are probably right, most of the time. But not always. And when they are wrong, people die. The Pons Aemilius collapse should have been a watershed moment in the history of engineering. It should have forced engineers to rethink their methods. It should have forced them to question their assumptions. It should have forced them to develop new ways of thinking about how structures behave. It should have led to a revolution in engineering practice, but it did not. Instead, the collapse was forgotten. Or rather, it was remembered, but in a different way. It was remembered as a curious historical fact. A story about how even the great Romans had built a bridge that fell. But it was not remembered as a lesson. It was not remembered as a warning. And so the same mistakes were made again, and again, and again. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the history of technology. Knowledge that should be preserved is lost. Lessons that should be learned are forgotten. And the result is that the same mistakes are made repeatedly, across centuries, by different people in different contexts. It is as if humanity is fated to rediscover its failures, to learn the same painful lessons over and over. But why? Part of the answer is that knowledge is not automatically preserved. Just because something happened does not mean that the lesson from it will be understood and remembered. The lesson has to be explicitly extracted. It has to be written down. It has to be taught. It has to be part of the culture of the profession. With the Pons Aemilius, none of this happened. The bridge collapsed. People observed the collapse, but no one wrote a detailed analysis of why it had collapsed. No one published a theory about how the scaling of forces with bridge size could lead to failure. No one created a systematic way of thinking about the problem that could be passed down to future generations. So the knowledge died. The lesson was lost. By the time the Tacoma Narrows Bridge was being designed 1,500 years later, the context had changed. There were no direct connections to the Pons Aemilius. The designers knew that the Romans had built impressive structures, but they did not know the specific details of why those structures had failed. They did not know about the non-linear scaling of forces. They did not know about the dangers of overconfidence. So they made the same mistakes. And when the Tacoma Narrows Bridge failed, the same thing happened. The immediate lessons were learned. The profession became more careful about designing for wind-induced oscillations. But the deeper lessons were not always learned. The profession did not always extract the universal principle that confidence in your methods is dangerous, that scaling up designs is risky, that you must always question your assumptions. So when the Morandi Bridge was designed 50 years later, some of the lessons from Tacoma Narrows had been learned, but others had not been fully incorporated. and the bridge failed. This pattern of partial learning is one of the tragedies of the history of engineering. It is not that engineers are stupid or careless. It is that knowledge is fragile. It does not automatically propagate. It does not automatically become part of the common wisdom. It has to be actively transmitted. It has to be fought for. It has to be defended against the natural tendency to forget, to move on, to assume that the past is not relevant to the present. And this is where the history of bridges becomes a metaphor for something larger. It becomes a metaphor for how humanity learns from experience. It becomes a story about the difficulty of preserving knowledge. It becomes a reminder that wisdom is not automatically gained through experience. Experience has to be interpreted. Experience has to be understood. Experience has to be translated into principles that can guide future actions. And this translation is not easy. It is not automatic. It is something that has to be actively done. And if it is not done, if we simply move on to the next project, the next bridge, the next disaster, then the lessons are lost, and the same mistakes are made again. But not all bridges fail. In fact, most bridges do not fail. Most bridges are built, and they stand. They carry traffic for decades or centuries. They survive storms. They survive floods. They survive everything that the world throws at them. The question is, why? Why do some bridges fail while others do not? Part of the answer, of course, is luck. Some bridges encounter conditions that are within their design range. Some bridges are lucky enough to be built in locations where the natural forces are moderate. Some bridges are lucky enough to be properly maintained over their entire lifetime. But part of the answer is also something else. Some engineers across the centuries have managed to build bridges that are not just adequate but robust. Bridges that have safety margins built in. Bridges that can tolerate some degree of degradation without failing. Bridges that are built with enough conservatism to account for things that cannot be predicted. One example of such a bridge is the Pont du Gard in southern France. This is a Roman aqueduct bridge built in the 1st century AD. It is nearly 2,000 years old. It has stood through floods. It has stood through earthquakes. It has stood through centuries of disrepair. And it still stands. It still carries water, although not as much as it once did. Why has the Pont du Gard survived when the Pons Aemilius failed? Part of the reason is luck. The Pont du Gard has not been subjected to conditions as extreme as the conditions that brought down the Pons Aemilius. But part of the reason is also design. The Pont du Gard was built with massive stone. The arches are not too wide. The supports are very thick. The structure is overbuilt in a sense. There is a lot of stone in the Pont du Gard that is not strictly necessary to support the weight of the water and the structure itself. This excess stone is not a waste. It is insurance. It is a safety margin. It is a hedge against the unknown. It is a way of saying, we do not understand everything about how this structure will behave, so we are going to build it stronger than we think is necessary. And because of this conservatism, the Pont du Gard has survived for nearly 2,000 years. The lesson here is subtle but important. The Pont du Gard was not built according to the absolute minimum amount of material needed to hold up the weight. It was built with more material than the minimum. It was built with a safety factor built in. But this safety factor was not chosen arbitrarily. It was not chosen based on a calculation of risk. It was chosen based on intuition and experience. The builders of the Pont du Gard had seen other structures fail. They knew that things could go wrong. They knew that there were forces and conditions that they did not fully understand. And so, they built conservatively. They built with extra material. They built to last. And it has lasted. This is a different approach from the approach that led to the failure of the Pons Aemilius. The Pons Aemilius was built right at the edge of what was possible. The Pont du Gard was built with a comfortable margin. Why the difference? One possibility is that the builders of the Pont du Gard were more conservative by nature. But a more likely possibility is that by the time the Pont du Gard was built, the Romans had accumulated enough experience with failures that they knew to build with safety margins. They had seen structures fail. They knew that confidence could be misplaced. They knew that conservative design was better than aggressive design. But this knowledge was lost. By the time the Pons Aemilius was built, perhaps a century later, this hard-earned wisdom had faded. Or perhaps the ambition to build larger and more impressive structures led the designers to take more risks than they should have. The pattern is familiar. Success leading to confidence, confidence leading to risk-taking leading to failure. If we fast forward to the modern era, we can see the same pattern. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, completed in 1937, was designed with enormous safety margins. It was built much stronger than it needed to be. It was designed to withstand earthquakes, extreme winds, and currents that were unpredictable. The designers of the Golden Gate Bridge believed that it was better to build more strongly than necessary than to risk failure. And the Golden Gate Bridge has stood for more than 80 years without significant problems. It has survived earthquakes. It has survived storms. It has survived heavy use. It has proven the value of conservative design. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge, completed in 1940, just a few years after the Golden Gate Bridge, was designed differently. It was designed to be elegant and efficient. It was designed to use less steel than the Golden Gate Bridge. It was designed with smaller safety margins. It was designed to be innovative and modern. And it collapsed after 4 months. The lesson is not that innovation is bad or that beauty is dangerous. The lesson is that innovation without adequate safety margins can be dangerous. Beauty without robustness can be a liability. And there is something almost tragic about the pattern of bridge failures. Each time a bridge collapses, there is an investigation. There are lessons learned. There are changes made to building codes and standards. The engineering profession makes progress. And yet, the same types of failures keep happening. Structures that are overconfident in their design fail when subjected to unexpected conditions. Structures that are not properly maintained fail due to degradation. Structures that are built with inadequate safety margins fail when pushed beyond their expected operating conditions. It is as if we are on a treadmill. We keep running forward, but we never quite reach the goal of building structures that will never fail. Why is this? One answer is that human nature does not change. We are always confident in our abilities. We are always willing to push the boundaries. We are always ready to take risks in pursuit of progress or profit or prestige. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Without this confidence and this willingness to take risks, we would never build anything new. We would never innovate. We would never advance. The pyramids would never have been built. The cathedrals would never have been built. The Golden Gate Bridge would never have been built. But the price of this confidence and this risk-taking is that sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes bridges collapse. Sometimes people die. And the question becomes, is the price worth the progress? This is a question that every society has to answer for itself. How much risk are we willing to tolerate in pursuit of advancement? How much are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of efficiency? How much are we willing to gamble in pursuit of innovation? Different societies answer these questions differently. Some societies choose to build conservatively, with large safety margins, even if it means slower progress and less innovation. Other societies choose to push the boundaries, to build at the edge of what is possible, even if it means taking greater risks. The Romans at the time of the Pons Aemilius chose to push the boundaries. They chose to build a bridge larger and more ambitious than anything that had been built before, and the result was both magnificent and tragic. The bridge was beautiful and impressive, and it eventually failed. The designers of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge chose to push the boundaries. They chose to build an elegant, efficient suspension bridge with slender cables and graceful towers. And the result was both beautiful and tragic. The bridge was stunning to look at, and it collapsed. The designers of the Morandi Bridge chose efficiency. They chose to build a bridge with minimal safety margins in order to save money and materials, and the result was both economical and tragic. The bridge was cost-effective, and it collapsed, killing 43 people. These are not examples of stupidity or incompetence. These are examples of choices. Choices about how much risk to take. Choices about how to balance efficiency against safety. Choices about whether to build conservatively or aggressively. And the fact that these choices sometimes result in failure is not a sign that we should stop building. It is a sign that we should be more thoughtful about how we make these choices. The ghost of the Pons Aemilius haunts modern engineering not because the Romans were stupid, but because they were smart and confident and willing to take risks. And sometimes, when you are smart and confident and willing to take risks, things go wrong. The question is not how do we eliminate this risk. The question is how do we acknowledge this risk? How do we remain humble in the face of our own limitations? How do we build with adequate safety margins to account for the things we do not know? How do we preserve the lessons from failures so that we do not repeat them? This is the challenge of modern engineering. Not to build bigger or faster or more cheaply, but to build more wisely. To build with an awareness of our own limitations, to build with humility. The Ponte Rotto, the broken bridge, still stands in Rome. It is a ruin. It is missing the downstream arches. It is missing the roadway. It is missing the connecting structure that once made it whole. But it stands, one arch, a fragment, a remnant of what was once complete, and it is, in its brokenness, more eloquent than it was in its wholeness. When the bridge was complete, it was a functional structure. It did its job. It carried people across the river. It was impressive, certainly. It was a marvel of engineering. But it was, fundamentally, just a bridge. Now, as a ruin, it is something more. It is a meditation on failure. It is a reminder of hubris. It is a lesson written in stone about the limits of human ambition. Artists have painted it. Poets have written about it. Tourists visit it. And in all of this attention, there is a kind of teaching happening. The broken bridge is teaching us something. It is teaching us that even great works can fail. It is teaching us that confidence can be misplaced. It is teaching us that the future is not guaranteed. But is the broken bridge teaching the right lessons? This is where we circle back to the problem of interpretation. The Ponte Rotto can be interpreted in many ways. It can be seen as a testament to Roman engineering, proof that the bridge stood for 1,700 years before failing. It can be seen as a casualty of nature, proof that the river was too powerful to be bridged. It can be seen as a monument to fate, a reminder that human works are temporary. But the most important interpretation, the interpretation that should guide modern engineers, is this. The Ponte Rotto is a reminder that the methods used to design and build the bridge had limitations. The bridge failed not because of bad construction or bad luck, but because the design itself was at the edge of what was possible with the knowledge and methods available at the time. And this has implications for modern engineering. Modern engineers have better knowledge, they have better mathematics, they have better methods, but they also have the same tendency to push the boundaries.
They also have the same confidence in their methods. They also have the same limitations. And so the Ponte Rotto, standing in Rome after 1,700 years, is still teaching. It is still saying, be careful, be humble. Do not assume that you know everything. Do not assume that your methods are infallible. This is the message that should be heard not just by engineers, but by all of us. Because in a broader sense, the story of the Ponte Rotto is the story of all human endeavor. It is the story of how we build great things, and how those great things sometimes fail. It is the story of how we learn and how we forget. It is the story of how confidence and hubris can lead to disaster. And the lesson is timeless. The lesson applies not just to bridges, but to all structures, to buildings, to institutions, to systems, to civilizations. When we build something great, we tend to become confident. We tend to believe that the methods that work to build it will continue to work. We tend to underestimate the fragility of what we have built. And sometimes, when we are not paying attention, when we have become too comfortable, when we have forgotten the lessons of the past, the structure fails, and we are shocked, and we investigate, and we learn some lessons, and then we move on. And eventually, we make the same mistakes again. The Ponte Rotto stands as a witness to this cycle. It stands as a reminder. It stands, in its brokenness, as a complete and perfect monument to human limitation. Tomorrow, a bridge will be built somewhere in the world. It will be designed by competent engineers using modern methods. It will be built with modern materials. It will be tested and inspected. It will be documented and certified. And it will be open to traffic. And it will carry people safely across whatever obstacle it spans. But somewhere, in the design assumptions of that bridge, there are hidden limitations. Somewhere in the calculations of that bridge, there are risks that are not fully appreciated. Somewhere, in the confidence of the engineers who designed that bridge, there is the seed of potential failure. This is not a condemnation of the bridge or the engineers. This is simply the nature of engineering. We work at the edge of what is known. We push the boundaries of what is possible. And because we work at the edge, because we push the boundaries, sometimes we go too far. And so the question is not whether a bridge will fail. Some bridge, somewhere, will fail. The question is whether we are prepared to learn from that failure, whether we will extract the right lessons, whether we will actually change our behavior based on what we learn, because this is where the cycle can potentially be broken. If we study failures carefully, if we preserve the knowledge of those failures, if we pass that knowledge on to the next generation, if we are willing to be humble about our own limitations, if we are willing to question our assumptions, if we are willing to slow down and be conservative when we need to be conservative, then maybe we can reduce the number of failures. Maybe we can make structures safer. Maybe we can actually learn from history instead of repeating it. The Pons Aemilius taught us a lesson 1,700 years after its failure. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge taught us a lesson 80 years after its collapse. The Morandi Bridge taught us a lesson just a few years after it fell. Each of these failures has made engineering safer. Each one has led to changes in codes and standards and methods. Each one has saved lives. But the improvements are incremental. Each failure teaches something. But the underlying problem, the tendency to build with confidence at the edge of safety, the tendency to forget the lessons of the past, the tendency to assume that innovation equals progress, persists. And so there will be more failures. That is not something we can prevent. That is something we have to accept. But what we can do is learn to interpret those failures correctly. What we can do is extract the right lessons. What we can do is change our behavior based on what we learn. This is the challenge that lies ahead. Not to build perfectly safe structures, which is impossible, but to build structures that are safe enough and to learn from those structures that are not safe enough. The Ponte Roto, standing in Rome, is still teaching this lesson. It will continue to teach it long after we are gone. And the question is, are we listening? And that's where we'll leave tonight's journey. Somewhere out there, the sun is rising, and somewhere else, it's still deep night. Wherever you are, thank you for keeping me company in the quiet. We have traveled from Rome to modern times. We have seen bridges that stood for nearly 2,000 years, only to fail in a moment. We have seen modern engineering disasters that echo the mistakes of the ancient world. We have explored the psychology of confidence and the danger of assumptions. And what have we learned? We have learned that greatness and failure are often separated by the thinnest of lines. We have learned that the methods that work at one scale do not automatically work at another scale. We have learned that confidence in your methods is not the same as understanding why your methods work. We have learned that the ghosts of past failures haunt every new construction. That the lessons we fail to learn are the lessons we are condemned to repeat. That humility is not a weakness in engineering, but a necessity. And we have learned that the bridges we build are not just functional structures. They are monuments to human ambition. They are testaments to our desire to connect, to bridge divides, to reach across the impossible. But they are also reminders of our limitations. They are reminders that we do not understand everything, that our confidence can be misplaced, that the future is not guaranteed. If you're still awake, tell me, where in the world are you listening from right now? Are you an engineer? Are you someone who drives over bridges every day? Are you someone who wonders about the forces that hold up the structures in your world? I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me where this story found you. If you enjoyed drifting through the history of structures and failures with me, make sure to follow along for the next one. Until then, rest easy and let your mind wander kindly through the ruins of human ambition. This has been History for the Restless Mind. Until we meet again.